What if I told you one of humanity's greatest achievements might not have happened the way we've been told? That the iconic moment when Neil Armstrong took that famous small step onto the lunar surface could be surrounded by more questions than answers. It's been over 50 years since the Apollo missions captivated the world, yet even today, whispers and doubts linger in the shadows of this monumental event. Moon landing conspiracy theories have persisted through decades, evolving and multiplying in ways that range from curiously compelling to utterly absurd. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're about to journey through 33 of the most bizarre, head-scratching, and downright unbelievable moon landing conspiracy theories ever conceived. From claims that the whole thing was filmed on a soundstage to ideas involving secret government collaborations with extraterrestrial beings, these theories push the boundaries of imagination and skepticism. But here's the fascinating part. While some of these ideas might sound laughable at first, they reveal something profound about how we process unbelievable achievements, how trust in institutions has shifted over time, and why we're so drawn to alternative narratives even when they defy all logic. This isn't just about debunking or dismissing. It's about exploring the strange intersection of history, psychology, and sheer creativity. The Apollo missions represented a pinnacle of human courage and ingenuity, yet they've also become a canvas for our deepest doubts and wildest fantasies. So whether you're a space enthusiast, a skeptic, or just someone who loves a good mystery, you're in for a ride. We'll unravel these theories one by one, looking at where they came from, why they've stuck around, and what they say about us. Get ready to question everything you thought you knew about that giant leap for mankind. Let's start with perhaps one of the most visually compelling and enduring images from the entire Apollo program. The American flag proudly planted in the lunar soil, its stars and stripes appearing to ripple as if caught in a gentle breeze. For countless skeptics, this single observation became the cornerstone of their disbelief. How could a flag wave, they argued, in the complete vacuum of space where there is no air to create wind? This apparent anomaly seemed like a glaring error, a cinematic slip-up that revealed the whole production was shot on a Hollywood soundstage right here on Earth. The theory gained immense traction because it was based on something everyone could see with their own eyes in the publicly released photographs and television broadcasts. It felt like an obvious mistake, a piece of evidence that didn't require a degree in rocket science to understand. The fascinating truth, however, lies in the ingenious and very deliberate design of the flag assembly. NASA engineers were acutely aware that there would be no atmosphere on the moon to hold the flag out for a proud display. Letting it hang limply from the pole would have been a terrible visual for such a symbolic moment. Their solution was brilliantly simple yet effective. They included a horizontal crossbar at the top of the flagpole, a kind of telescoping rod that extended outward to keep the flag stretched taut and visible. The flag itself was essentially a curtain hung from this rod. When the astronauts were planting the pole, they had to twist it back and forth to work it into the tough lunar soil. This action imparted energy into the flexible rod and the flag material itself. On Earth, that energy would be quickly dissipated by air resistance, causing the movement to stop almost immediately. But on the airless moon, there's nothing to slow that motion down. The flag continued to oscillate back and forth for some time after the astronauts let go, much like a pendulum swinging in a frictionless environment. What we perceive as waving is actually the fabric vibrating and slowly settling after being disturbed. There was no wind, only physics in its purest form. This explanation doesn't just debunk the theory, it adds another layer of awe to the achievement, highlighting how every tiny detail, even the planting of a flag, required incredible foresight and innovation. Another powerful piece of evidence for skeptics lies not in what the Apollo photos show, but in what they seem to be missing: the stars. If you look at any of the iconic images taken on the lunar surface, the flag planting, the lunar module, astronauts bouncing in the low gravity, you'll see a deep, pitch-black sky completely devoid of any stars. For many, this was an instant red flag. We've all been to places on Earth with clear, dark skies and been awestruck by the brilliant tapestry of stars overhead. The Moon, with no atmosphere and no light pollution, should offer the most spectacular star-filled view in the solar system. The fact that not a single star is visible in these photographs felt to conspiracy theorists like a catastrophic oversight by the filmmakers. They argued that this proved the astronauts were actually inside a dark soundstage with a black backdrop, a simple and cheap solution that unfortunately forgot to include the most obvious feature of space. This argument is incredibly compelling on an emotional level because it taps into our own earthly experiences. But the reality is a perfect example of how the lunar environment is so alien that our intuition fails us. The explanation comes down to the basic physics of photography and the challenging conditions the astronauts faced. The lunar surface during the day is brutally bright, bathed in unfiltered sunlight. The soil itself, called regolith, is made up of tiny, glass-like particles that are highly reflective. This created an extremely high contrast scene, brilliantly bright white spacesuits and a gleaming lander against a dark gray soil, all under the stark glare of the sun. The cameras used by the astronauts, specially modified Hasselblads, had to be set to capture this brightly lit landscape correctly. To avoid overexposing the entire image into a featureless white blob, they needed very fast shutter speeds and small apertures. These settings allow just a tiny amount of light to hit the film. The stars, while incredibly bright to the human eye, are extremely faint light sources compared to the sunlit lunar surface. The camera's exposure was simply not set to collect enough light to make those incredibly dim points visible. They were completely washed out by the overwhelming brightness all around them. It's the same reason you can't see stars in the background of a photograph taken on a sunny day here on Earth. Your camera is set for the bright daylight and the stars are too faint to register. Furthermore, the astronauts themselves reported that their eyes needed to adjust to the extreme contrast. While they could see stars from the moon, they could only do so by cupping their hands around their eyes to block out the blinding glare of the surface and the sun, effectively creating a makeshift telescope. The camera had no such luxury, so rather than being proof of a hoax, the blank black sky in the Apollo photos is actually a silent testament to the authentic, harsh, and otherworldly lighting conditions the pioneers had to work with. Moving from the black, starless sky, another visual detail seized upon by skeptics involves the play of light and shadow across the lunar surface. If you examine some of the Apollo photographs, you might notice something that feels instinctively wrong. Shadows that appear to fall in different directions or that have varying lengths, even when cast by objects that are relatively close to each other. To a casual observer, this looks exactly like what you'd see on a movie set with multiple spotlights, each one casting its own distinct shadow and creating a confusing web of darkness. Conspiracy theorists argued that this was a dead giveaway, proving that NASA had filmed the entire moonwalk under the bright artificial lights of a television studio. After all, everyone knows there's only one sun, so there should only be one light source and all shadows should be parallel. The presence of these seemingly inconsistent shadows became a cornerstone of the hoax argument, presented as simple, undeniable evidence anyone could understand. This theory is so persuasive because it's built on our everyday experience here on Earth. In a room with a single lamp, all shadows are consistent. The logic seems unassailable. But the moon is not a room, and its environment behaves in ways that constantly defy our terrestrial intuition. The key to unraveling this mystery lies in understanding two major factors: the reflective nature of the lunar landscape and the distorting effects of camera perspective. First, consider the ground itself. The lunar soil or regolith isn't like dark Earth. It's made of countless tiny, glassy particles that are incredibly reflective. It acts almost like a field of minuscule mirrors. When the intense, unfiltered sunlight hits this surface, it doesn't just get absorbed, it bounces everywhere. This phenomenon is called reflected light or ambient illumination. So, while the sun is the primary light source, it's not the only one. The brightly lit ground itself becomes a secondary light source, softly filling in shadows and illuminating areas that would otherwise be pitch black. This is why the shadows on the moon aren't the deep, stark black we're used to seeing on a sunny day on Earth. You can often see details within them. This complex lighting environment, with light bouncing from every direction, can create the visual impression of multiple light sources when there is truly only one. The second, and perhaps more crucial, factor is perspective. The photographs in question are two-dimensional representations of a three-dimensional world. Our brains are trained to interpret these images based on earthly rules, but the moon's lack of atmosphere and familiar landmarks creates a disorienting landscape. The apparent non-parallel shadows are almost always an illusion caused by the angle at which the photo was taken and the contours of the ground. A shadow falling away from the camera on a slight incline will look very different from a shadow falling across a small crater or a ridge right next to it. Our brain interprets these differences in length and angle as evidence of different light sources, when in reality, it's just a trick of depth perception on a rolling, uneven terrain. It's the same reason railroad tracks appear to converge in the distance. It's a perspective effect, not evidence that the tracks are actually getting closer together. So, what appears to be a glaring error in a Hollywood set is actually a brilliant confirmation of authenticity. The complex shadows are a direct result of the unique and challenging lighting conditions on the moon, a silent testament to a landscape so alien that it constantly tricks the human eye into seeing familiar patterns where none exist. Perhaps one of the most scientifically intimidating arguments against the moon landings involves an invisible, yet incredibly deadly, barrier surrounding our planet, the Van Allen radiation belts. The theory posits that crossing these zones of intense radiation would have been a death sentence for the Apollo crews, frying them with lethal doses of cosmic rays and proving that the entire mission was impossible, therefore fake. It's a compelling argument because it's built on a foundation of genuine scientific concern. These belts, named after their discoverer James Van Allen, are not some minor hurdle. They are two massive, donut-shaped rings of charged particles, primarily protons and electrons, trapped by Earth's magnetic field. The inner belt is especially fierce, with protons possessing energy so high they can punch through several centimeters of lead. To the average person, the idea that astronauts sailed right through this radioactive minefield and lived to tell the tale does sound far-fetched, if not utterly unbelievable. The brilliance of NASA's solution, however, lies not in some mythical futuristic technology, but in a masterful application of physics, precise timing, and straightforward engineering. The key misunderstanding in the conspiracy theory is the assumption that the spacecraft spent a long time cruising through the most intense parts of the belt. In reality, the transit was remarkably quick. The Apollo command module was essentially a bullet firing itself toward the moon, traveling at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour. By carefully calculating the trajectory, NASA engineers had the spacecraft punch through the thinnest, least intense region of the belts. Their path took them through the Van Allen belts in a matter of hours, not days, drastically limiting the astronauts' total exposure. But speed alone wasn't the only layer of protection. The spacecraft itself was a meticulously designed shield. The hull of the command module was constructed from a layered aluminum alloy, a material proven to be highly effective at blocking the specific types of radiation found in the belts. Think of it not as a flimsy tin can, but as a sturdy, purpose-built suit of armor. Furthermore, the crew's vital organs were offered additional protection by the ship's layout and stored equipment, which was strategically placed to act as supplementary radiation shielding. The final, and perhaps most convincing, piece of evidence is the dosimeters the astronauts carried. These devices meticulously recorded the total radiation dose each crew member received throughout the entire mission. The data showed that the quick transit through the Van Allen belts contributed only a small fraction to their overall exposure. The total dose for an Apollo astronaut was typically less than what a nuclear plant worker or an airline pilot receives in a year, and far below the level considered dangerous for a short-term mission. So, rather than being a barrier that proved the moon landings were a hoax, the successful navigation of the Van Allen belts stands as a stunning testament to the meticulous planning and engineering prowess of the thousands of people who made Apollo possible. They understood the danger not as an insurmountable wall, but as a complex problem to be solved with calculation and ingenuity. Another powerful visual that fueled the fires of doubt was the lunar module itself, specifically what wasn't beneath it, a massive blast crater. The reasoning from skeptics was straightforward and seemed grounded in common sense. They'd seen the immense, fiery plume of the Saturn V rocket at liftoff, a controlled explosion powerful enough to scar the Earth and punch through the atmosphere. The lunar module's descent engine, while smaller, was still a rocket motor firing directly at the ground. Shouldn't such a powerful force, they argued, have excavated a significant pit in the lunar soil upon landing? The fact that the lander's footpads appeared to be resting on undisturbed, powdery surface, with no visible crater and no signs of scorching or melting from the exhaust, was presented as undeniable proof. It looked for all the world as if the module had been gently lowered into place by a crane on a soundstage, not by a roaring rocket engine. This theory hinges on a fundamental misunderstanding of the environment and the engineering involved. The expectation of a large crater and a scorched surface is based on our experience with rockets in Earth's atmosphere, but the Moon is a completely different world with two critical factors at play. There's no air, and the engine was dramatically throttled down. First, consider the atmosphere, or rather, the lack of one. On Earth, a rocket's exhaust plume is a wide, fiery, turbulent cloud because it's interacting with our dense atmosphere. The gases expand violently outward, kicking up huge amounts of dust and debris and transferring a tremendous amount of energy to the ground, which can indeed create a blast crater. But in the vacuum of space, a rocket's exhaust behaves entirely differently. Without air molecules to push against, the exhaust gases expand in a much narrower, more focused cone directly away from the nozzle. This means the energy is not dispersed widely, it's concentrated in a tight column. Second, and most importantly, the engine wasn't firing at full power during the final moments of descent. The lunar module's descent engine was throttleable, a remarkable feat of engineering for its time. As the astronauts approached the surface, they were flying on a dead stop, hovering and then descending very slowly. In the final seconds before touchdown, the engine was throttled down to just a fraction of its total thrust, essentially just enough to counteract the Moon's weak gravity and allow for a gentle, controlled descent. The force hitting the ground was not a violent, concentrated blast, but more like a wide, diffuse puff of gas. Finally, the composition of the lunar surface itself played a crucial role. The Moon isn't covered in a thick, fluffy powder like talcum powder. The regolith is a complex mix of fine dust, sharp, glassy particles, and rocky fragments. It's cohesive and compacted. The low-pressure exhaust from the engine in those final seconds would have simply blown the loose top layer of this compacted soil away, scattering it radially and leaving the harder, more solid layer beneath completely undisturbed. There was no need for the exhaust to dig a crater because it was essentially just dusting off a table. The absence of a large crater isn't a mistake. It's the precise, predicted outcome of brilliant engineering meeting an alien environment, confirming the landing was every bit as real as the ground the astronauts stood on. This next theory takes us from the static images of photography into the dynamic realm of moving pictures, focusing on the very gait of the astronauts themselves. Some observers claimed the famous bunny hop movement of the Apollo crews didn't look quite right. The argument was that the footage appeared slightly off, almost as if it had been filmed here on Earth at a higher speed, and then played back in slow motion to simulate the slow, floating leaps we associate with low gravity. It was a clever idea, suggesting that NASA's special effects department had used a simple cinematic trick to create the illusion of an alien environment. After all, we've all seen slow-motion replays of athletes jumping, and the elongated, floating arc does share a superficial resemblance to the movements on the lunar surface. The flaw in this theory, however, reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of physics and the nuanced differences between true low-gravity movement and the artificial slowing of high-gravity motion. While both can make action seem drawn out, the underlying forces at work create entirely different physical outcomes. When you film a high jump on Earth and play it in slow motion, you are simply stretching time. The athlete's body is still subject to Earth's full gravity throughout the entire maneuver. Their upward acceleration is fought by gravity every inch of the way, and their descent is a rapid, punishing pull back to the ground that the slow motion effect only makes look gentler. On the Moon, the entire physical reality is different. The gravity isn't an illusion, it's genuinely only 1/6 as strong. This isn't just about things falling slower, it changes the entire equation of motion. An astronaut's muscles, evolved for Earth's gravity, can generate 6 times the force relative to the gravity they're working against. A gentle push with their calves results in a powerful, soaring leap. Because the gravitational pull is so weak, their ascent is slower, their peak altitude is much higher, and most tellingly, their descent is a gradual, gentle float back down. There's no sudden jolt upon landing because the force pulling them down is so minimal. The key visual giveaway is in the dust. When an astronaut jumps on the Moon, the dust kicked up by their boots also behaves according to lunar physics. It doesn't puff up in a cloud and quickly fall, weighted down by Earth like gravity. Instead, it follows beautiful, elegant parabolic arcs, each particle rising and falling with the same slow, predictable trajectory, hanging in the vacuum for a surprisingly long time before settling back to the surface. This coordinated ballet of dust and astronaut is something that slow-motion footage of an Earth jump could never authentically replicate. On Earth, even in slow motion, dust would behave erratically, affected by air resistance and falling with a speed that would betray its true environment. The seemingly odd movement wasn't a camera trick. It was the perfect, unfakeable signature of a human body interacting with an entirely new set of physical laws. Another visual anomaly that sent conspiracy theorists into a frenzy involves a tiny but crucial detail present in every official Apollo photograph: the Rousseau crosshairs. These are the little plus sign markers, often called fiducials, that you can see etched onto the glass plate inside the astronauts' modified Hasselblad cameras. Their purpose was purely scientific. They provided a fixed reference grid that allowed photogrammetrists back on Earth to make precise measurements of the objects in the frame, calculating distances and sizes with accuracy. The conspiracy argument zeroes in on instances where these crosshairs, which were physically inscribed on the camera's interior, appear to be behind bright objects in the photograph, most notably the American flag or parts of the lunar module. To a skeptical eye, this was the ultimate smoking gun, undeniable proof that an object had been superimposed over an existing background image, clumsily covering up the crosshairs and revealing the whole photo to be a composite forgery. It seemed like a digital editing mistake centuries before Photoshop even existed. This theory is perhaps one of the most technically interesting because it requires understanding not a planetary environment, but the very nature of photography and light itself. The explanation isn't found on the moon, but inside the camera. The crosshairs were etched onto a glass plate that sat precisely in the film plane, meaning they were physically between the lens and the film. For any object that wasn't overwhelmingly bright, the crosshair would indeed appear in front, sitting atop the image as expected. However, when the camera was pointed at an extremely bright, sunlit object like the pristine white nylon of the flag or the highly reflective gold foil insulation on the lunar module, the intense light from that object would literally bleed through the emulsion of the film. This phenomenon is known as overexposure or blooming. In the areas of the film where the light was most intense, the photographic emulsion would become completely saturated. This overload of light would effectively wash out any finer detail, including the thin, dark lines of the crosshairs that were superimposed on top of it. The crosshair doesn't disappear, it's simply obliterated by the sheer amount of light flooding that specific spot on the film. Our eyes and brains interpret this as the bright object being in front of the crosshair, but it's an illusion of perception. The crosshair is still there on the original negative, but the light that defines the bright object has overwhelmed it. It's the photographic equivalent of trying to see a thin black thread laid on top of a blazingly bright light bulb. The bulb's glare makes the thread vanish from view. This effect is a well-documented characteristic of film photography and is even seen in digital sensors today. So, what was presented as the most definitive evidence of tampering is in fact one of the strongest validations of the photograph's authenticity, a perfect and predictable artifact of capturing brilliantly lit objects on film. Yet another layer of the hoax narrative involves a more meticulous, almost detective-like scrutiny of the lunar landscape itself. Keen-eyed skeptics poring over the archives from different Apollo missions claim to have found a shocking duplication. They pointed to specific photographs taken on the surface, say from Apollo 15 and another from Apollo 17, that appeared to show the same cluster of hills or the exact same arrangement of boulders on the horizon. The accusation was audacious that a cash-strapped NASA, in a rush to produce 6 successful landings, had gotten lazy. They had simply reused the same painted backdrop or the same desert filming location for multiple missions, never anticipating that eagle-eyed members of the public would one day cross-reference the photos and catch them in the act. It was presented as the ultimate evidence of cost-cutting fraud, a mistake so blatant it seemed to unravel the entire endeavor. To understand why this theory is so compelling, you have to put yourself in the shoes of someone looking at these photos for the first time. The lunar landscape is, by its very nature, bizarre and unfamiliar. Without trees, rivers, or any of the normal markers we use to judge scale and distance, one barren, cratered hill can look remarkably similar to another. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, and they're exceptionally good at finding familiar shapes in chaos. When a skeptic lines up 2 photos from different missions that both show a sweeping, nondescript plain with mountains in the distance, the immediate reaction can be to see a match. It feels like finding 2 different family photos taken in front of the same generic backdrop at a department store. The reality, however, completely dismantles this claim and in doing so, highlights the incredible diversity of the moon's geology. Each Apollo landing site was chosen with immense scientific care, specifically for its unique and distinct features. The sites were scattered across the lunar surface, ranging from the dark, flat lunar mares to the rugged highlands. When geologists and astronomers examine the same photographs, they don't see duplicates, they see fingerprints. For instance, the backdrop of Apollo 15 is dominated by the Apennine mountain range and the immense Hadley Rill, an ancient lava channel that snakes across the landscape. Compare this to Apollo 17, which landed in a valley of the Taurus-Littrow region, nestled between even more massive mountains and surrounded by distinctive, light-colored landslide deposits. The specific angles of the slopes, the sizes and frequencies of the craters, the types of rock formations, all of these are meticulously documented and are completely unique to each site. The boulders at one site have a different mineral composition and erosion pattern than those at another. The supposed matches that conspiracy theorists found are a classic case of misinterpreting low-resolution images and ignoring scale. A hill that looks similar in two photos might be half the size and dozens of kilometers further away in one compared to the other. What appears to be an identical background is actually a testament to the power of perspective on an airless world, where distant objects don't get hazy and even far-off mountains appear in crystal clarity. Far from being proof of a hoax, the ability to distinguish these landing sites geologically is one of the strongest confirmations of their authenticity. It shows that we didn't just go to the moon once, we explored 6 different worlds, each with its own story written in stone. Now, let's turn our attention to a piece of footage that has become a cornerstone of the moon hoax argument, the moment the flag is planted and appears to wave. In the video, as the astronauts work to push the flagpole into the ground, the flag's fabric can be seen shifting and oscillating. To many viewers, this motion looks uncannily like the fluttering of a flag in a gentle breeze. Since we all know there's no wind on the airless moon, this single observation has been presented as the ultimate proof that the entire event was staged on a film set here on Earth, with a flag being subtly ruffled by a fan or a draft. It's a powerful argument because it's based on a dynamic, moving image that seems to defy the very laws of physics governing the lunar environment. The fascinating truth behind this phenomenon isn't a secret film set error, but a brilliant piece of mechanical engineering and a perfect demonstration of physics in a vacuum. The key to understanding the movement lies in the unique way the flag was deployed. The flag assembly wasn't just a simple pole with a cloth attached. It was a sophisticated kit designed to solve a very specific problem. How do you make a flag stand out proudly when there's no atmosphere to hold it up? NASA's solution was to include a horizontal crossbar at the top of the pole, much like a curtain rod. This rod telescoped out to keep the flag stretched taut, preventing it from hanging limply against the pole, a terrible visual for such a symbolic moment. When the astronauts were planting the pole, they had to twist it back and forth to work it into the surprisingly tough lunar soil. This twisting action didn't just move the pole, it imparted energy into the entire system, the flexible horizontal rod and the flag material itself. On Earth, this kind of energy would be quickly dissipated by air resistance. The movement would stop almost instantly, but on the moon, with no air molecules to provide friction and slow it down, that energy had nowhere to go. The flag and its support rod continued to oscillate back and forth for a surprisingly long time, slowly damping down as the energy was gradually absorbed by the materials themselves. What we perceive as waving is actually a slow mechanical vibration, a kind of wobble, as the entire assembly settles into place. There was no breeze, no secret fan on a soundstage. There was only the transfer of human energy into a mechanical system operating in a frictionless environment. This simple, physics-based explanation not only debunks the conspiracy theory, but adds another layer of awe to the achievement, highlighting how even the most ceremonial aspects of the mission were subject to the strange and beautiful laws of the universe. Another powerful visual that fueled the fires of doubt was the lunar module itself, specifically what wasn't beneath it, a massive blast crater. The reasoning from skeptics was straightforward and seemed grounded in common sense. They'd seen the immense fiery plume of the Saturn V rocket at liftoff, a controlled explosion powerful enough to scar the Earth and punch through the atmosphere. The lunar module's descent engine, while smaller, was still a rocket motor firing directly at the ground. Shouldn't such a powerful force, they argued, have excavated a significant pit in the lunar soil upon landing? The fact that the lander's footpads appear to be resting on undisturbed, powdery surface, with no visible crater and no signs of scorching or melting from the exhaust, was presented as undeniable proof. It looked for all the world as if the module had been gently lowered into place by a crane on a soundstage, not by a roaring rocket engine. This theory hinges on a fundamental misunderstanding of the environment and the engineering involved. The expectation of a large crater and a scorched surface is based on our experience with rockets in Earth's atmosphere, but the Moon is a completely different world with two critical factors at play. There's no air, and the engine was dramatically throttled down. First, consider the atmosphere, or rather, the lack of one. On Earth, a rocket's exhaust plume is a wide, fiery, turbulent cloud because it's interacting with our dense atmosphere. The gases expand violently outward, kicking up huge amounts of dust and debris and transferring a tremendous amount of energy to the ground, which can indeed create a blast crater. But in the vacuum of space, a rocket's exhaust behaves entirely differently. Without air molecules to push against, the exhaust gases expand in a much narrower, more focused cone directly away from the nozzle. This means the energy is not dispersed widely, it's concentrated in a tight column. Second, and most importantly, the engine wasn't firing at full power during the final moments of descent. The lunar module's descent engine was throttleable, a remarkable feat of engineering for its time. As the astronauts approached the surface, they were flying on a dead stop, hovering and then descending very slowly. In the final seconds before touchdown, the engine was throttled down to just a fraction of its total thrust, essentially just enough to counteract the Moon's weak gravity and allow for a gentle, controlled descent. The force hitting the ground was not a violent, concentrated blast, but more like a wide, diffuse puff of gas. Finally, the composition of the lunar surface itself played a crucial role. The Moon isn't covered in a thick, fluffy powder like talcum powder. The regolith is a complex mix of fine dust, sharp, glassy particles, and rocky fragments. It's cohesive and compacted. The low-pressure exhaust from the engine in those final seconds would have simply blown the loose top layer of this compacted soil away, scattering it radially and leaving the harder, more solid layer beneath completely undisturbed. There was no need for the exhaust to dig a crater because it was essentially just dusting off a table. The absence of a large crater isn't a mistake. It's the precise, predicted outcome of brilliant engineering meeting an alien environment, confirming the landing was every bit as real as the ground the astronauts stood on. Beyond the visual and physical anomalies, another sophisticated layer of the conspiracy theory delves into the realm of bureaucracy and archival records. Proponents of the hoax narrative claim that if the Apollo program was real, there should exist an immense, publicly accessible mountain of technical documentation, blueprints, engineering schematics, and detailed design documents for every component, especially for a machine as novel and complex as the lunar module. The assertion is that critical documents for the lander have either been mysteriously lost or, more damningly, never existed in the first place. This theory suggests that the absence of this paperwork is the ultimate admission of guilt from NASA, proving they never actually built the hardware and thus could not possibly have the plans for it. This argument preys on a common public perception of how large government projects should work, imagining a pristine, centralized library containing every single drawing and memo. The reality of massive, decade-long engineering projects, especially ones conducted across multiple private contractors, is far messier and more complex. Let's break down what documents conspiracy theorists claim are missing versus what actually exists and is available today. The claim often focuses on the critical or top-level assembly drawings for the lunar module, the master plans that would show how every single part fits together. The implication is that without these specific documents, the vehicle couldn't have been built, so their alleged absence is proof it never was. In truth, the volume of remaining Apollo documentation is staggering, numbering in the hundreds of thousands of pages. NASA has tirelessly worked to preserve and digitize this material, making vast collections available through their archives and university partnerships. You can find operation manuals, flight plans, technical debriefs, and thousands upon thousands of engineering drawings. However, it is not a complete set. The notion of missing documents isn't a conspiracy. It's a simple fact of historical preservation for a project that involved over 20,000 contracting companies half a century ago. Paper degrades, offices move, companies go out of business or merge, and files are inevitably misplaced or discarded during these transitions. This is not unique to Apollo. It's a challenge faced by historians documenting any major historical event. Furthermore, what constitutes a critical document is subjective. A hoax theorist might point to the absence of a single mythical schematic that shows the entire lunar module on one page. But in real-world engineering, no such singular document exists for something that complex. The design was broken down into an immense hierarchy of drawings, from system-level diagrams down to individual part specifications for a single bolt. While some lower-level drawings from certain contractors may have been lost to time, the comprehensive body of documentation that remains is more than sufficient to understand the vehicle's design and construction. This vast archive doesn't hint at a cover-up. It stands as a monumental testament to the project's breathtaking scale and meticulousness, a paper trail so extensive it continues to be studied by engineers and historians to this day. Moving from the engineering feats to the artistic ones, we come to a theory that focuses on the stunning quality of the Apollo imagery itself. Skeptics argue that the photographs are just too good to be true. The exposures are perfect, the compositions are beautifully framed, and there isn't a single blurry, out-of-focus shot of the once-in-a-lifetime events. Given the immense pressure, the bulky spacesuits with their limited mobility, and the alien, high-contrast environment, how could every single picture look like it was taken by a seasoned professional? The implication is that such flawless photography would be impossible under real lunar conditions, pointing instead to a carefully choreographed production with a skilled ground crew operating the cameras. It suggests the astronauts were merely actors, and the true photographers were hidden just outside the frame on a soundstage. This theory is fascinating because it doesn't rely on a perceived error, but on a perceived perfection that seems to defy the chaos of reality. It's a testament to just how incredible the Apollo photos really are. The explanation, however, is a wonderful blend of cutting-edge technology, meticulous preparation, and surprisingly simple, foolproof principles. First, let's talk about the camera. The astronauts weren't using a standard consumer model you could buy at a store. They were equipped with specially modified Hasselblad 500L cameras. These were medium-format beasts, renowned for their exceptional image quality and ruggedness, but the key modifications made them virtually astronaut-proof. The most crucial change was the removal of the reflex mirror and the standard viewfinder. The astronauts couldn't put the camera to their eye with their helmets on, so NASA replaced the viewfinder with a simple, large sighting ring mounted on top. You didn't compose a shot through a lens, you essentially aimed the camera like a gun, using the ring to get a rough idea of what was in frame. This leads directly to the second point, the training. The astronauts, particularly those slated for the lunar surface walks, underwent extensive photography training. They weren't just taught how to press a button, they were drilled on the principles of composition and exposure until it became second nature. They practiced with the modified cameras while wearing their pressurized gloves, learning how to operate the large controls designed for their bulky fingers. They memorized settings and learned to judge lighting conditions on the fly. The Hasselblads were, by design, incredibly simple to use for basic operation. The focus was fixed to infinity. The aperture and shutter speed were often pre-set by mission control based on the known lighting conditions, leaving the astronaut with little more to do than point and shoot. The film magazines were pre-loaded, and the camera itself was attached to the front of their suit, making it always accessible. Finally, the perfect composition can be attributed to a very straightforward rule that every photography student learns, the Sunny 16 rule. This old adage states that on a bright, sunny day, you can set your aperture to f16 and your shutter speed to the reciprocal of your film's speed to get a perfect exposure. The lunar surface is the ultimate sunny day, with no atmosphere to diffuse the light. NASA engineers calculated the exact lunar equivalent of this rule, and the cameras were largely set to these predetermined settings. As for the beautiful framing without a viewfinder, the astronauts relied on a technique called shooting from the hip. They would take multiple overlapping shots of every important subject from slightly different angles and distances. They were instructed to be prolific, to shoot as much film as possible. With hundreds of frames to choose from, the photo editors back on Earth could then select the very best, most perfectly composed images from the bunch. The flawless gallery we see today isn't the result of a single perfect click. It's the curated collection from thousands of shots, a visual record made possible by superb equipment, brilliant simplification, and astronauts who are trained not just as pilots and scientists, but as documentarians of history. Looking even closer at the footage, some theorists believed they had found the most literal smoking gun of all, the wires that held everything up. In certain frames, as an astronaut jumps or stumbles, a keen-eyed observer might spot what appears to be a thin, glossy line extending from the suit toward the top of the frame. To those convinced of a hoax, this was the ultimate revelation, the visible proof of the hidden harness system used to simulate the moon's low gravity on a film set. They argued that these fleeting glimpses of a taut cable were the one mistake the special effects team couldn't hide. The moment the illusion broke and revealed the actors being puppeted on wires against a painted backdrop. This claim gains its power from its specificity. It doesn't deal with abstract physics, but points to a tangible visual artifact that anyone can pause and try to spot for themselves. The idea that NASA would use such a primitive method, wires, to fake the iconic 1/6 gravity hops feels almost ironically low-tech for a mission of such supposed complexity. The frames in question are often blurry, grainy, and shot from a distance, which ironically makes the argument stronger for believers, as the low resolution allows the imagination to fill in the gaps, turning a mere speck or streak into a definitive cable. The true explanation for these mysterious lines is far less theatrical, but reveals much more about the realities of suiting up for a walk on the moon. The astronaut spacesuits were not sleek, seamless uniforms. They were incredibly complex personal spacecraft, crisscrossed with a network of life support systems. A key component of this network was the liquid cooling garment, a mesh undersuit threaded with miles of tiny plastic tubing through which water circulated to keep the astronaut from overheating in the sun's unfiltered rays. Additionally, the exterior of the suit had multiple connection points and conduits for oxygen and communication lines that ran back to the portable life support system, the backpack they wore. What conspiracy theorists interpret as a suspicious wire from the ceiling is almost always one of two things. Often, it's a stray thread from a fabric-based communication cable or a tether for a tool, momentarily caught in the harsh, direct sunlight. The lunar environment lacks an atmosphere to scatter light, so these individual threads can catch the sun at a specific angle and reflect it with surprising intensity, creating a bright, sharp line that looks artificial against the matte background of the suit or the sky. In other instances, it's a shadow. The complex folding and contortion of the suit's fabric as the astronaut moves can create sharp, linear creases. When the sun hits these deep folds at the right angle, it can cast a long, straight, and very dark shadow that visually resembles a wire. Furthermore, the motion of these wires never matches what a suspension cable would do. A true support wire would be under constant tension, pulling taut the moment the astronaut left the ground. The alleged wires in the footage, however, behave with a whipping, languid motion that follows the movement of the astronaut's body. They flap, curl, and drift, moving with the inertia of the jump rather than controlling it from above. They are passive participants in the action, not the cause of it. This subtle detail in the footage doesn't expose a hoax. It provides a silent, real-time record of the intricate and fragile web of technology that kept those explorers alive in an utterly inhospitable world. So far, we've focused on the still photographs, but what about the moving images? This next theory takes the argument about the missing stars and applies it to the live television broadcast. If the moon's sky is so brilliantly star-filled, why is the video footage just as blank and black as the photos? Astronauts like Alan Shepard of Apollo 14 even reported that when they shielded their eyes from the sun and the bright ground, the stars were incredibly vivid and beautiful. This creates a powerful point of contention. If the astronauts could see them with their own eyes, why couldn't the cameras see them too? It seems like a direct contradiction, fueling the idea that the live video feed was nothing more than a staged broadcast from a soundstage with a simple black curtain. The resolution to this puzzle lies in understanding the monumental technical challenge of broadcasting television from 250,000 miles away in the 1960s. The camera used for the first moonwalk, the Westinghouse Lunar camera, was a marvel of engineering, but it was not a magical device. It had severe limitations, particularly in its ability to capture a wide range of light and dark in the same shot. The primary goal of the live video was to show the world the historic first steps of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. This meant the camera's exposure settings had to be optimized for the most important subject: the astronauts themselves, their white spacesuits, and the brightly sunlit lunar surface. To capture those details without turning the entire image into a blinding white smear, the camera required a very fast shutter speed and a small aperture. This setting allowed just a tiny amount of light to hit the imaging tube. The stars, while bright to the dark adapted human eye, are incredibly faint point sources of light. They simply weren't bright enough to register on the camera's sensor at those exposure settings. It's the exact same principle as trying to film stars from a brightly lit city street at night. Your phone camera will show the streetlights and buildings clearly, but the sky will appear completely black. The camera was doing its job perfectly, but its job was specifically to document the human activity on the moon, not to act as an astronomical telescope. Furthermore, the signal itself had to travel an incredible distance. The data was compressed and transmitted with limited bandwidth, which naturally prioritized the sharp, high-contrast details of the astronauts and the lunar module over the subtle, low-contrast information of a star field. Adding stars to the broadcast would have required a completely different camera setup with a much longer exposure, which would have rendered the astronauts as featureless, overexposed ghosts. NASA made the only practical choice. They prioritized the human story. The fact that the stars are absent from the video is not proof of a hoax. It's proof of the pragmatic engineering decisions made to share this monumental human achievement with the world, given the incredible technological constraints of the era. Perhaps one of the most scientifically intimidating arguments against the moon landings involves an invisible, yet incredibly deadly, barrier surrounding our planet, the Van Allen radiation belts. The theory posits that crossing these zones of intense radiation would have been a death sentence for the Apollo crews, frying them with lethal doses of cosmic rays and proving that the entire mission was impossible, therefore fake. It's a compelling argument because it's built on a foundation of genuine scientific concern. These belts, named after their discoverer James Van Allen, are not some minor hurdle. They are two massive, donut-shaped rings of charged particles, primarily protons and electrons, trapped by Earth's magnetic field. The inner belt is especially fierce, with protons possessing energy so high they can punch through several centimeters of lead. To the average person, the idea that astronauts sailed right through this radioactive minefield and lived to tell the tale does sound far-fetched, if not utterly unbelievable. The danger doesn't stop there either, as the theory correctly points out the constant background threat from galactic cosmic rays, high-energy particles originating from outside our solar system that also bombard any traveler in deep space. The brilliance of NASA's solution, however, lies not in some mythical futuristic technology, but in a masterful application of physics, precise timing, and straightforward engineering. The key misunderstanding in the conspiracy theory is the assumption that the spacecraft spent a long time cruising through the most intense parts of the belts. In reality, the transit was remarkably quick. The Apollo command module was essentially a bullet firing itself toward the moon, traveling at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour. By carefully calculating the trajectory, NASA engineers had the spacecraft punch through the thinnest, least intense region of the belts. Their path took them through the Van Allen belts in a matter of hours, not days, drastically limiting the astronauts' total exposure. But speed alone wasn't the only layer of protection. The spacecraft itself was a meticulously designed shield. The hull of the command module was constructed from a layered aluminum alloy, a material proven to be highly effective at blocking the specific types of radiation found in the belts. Think of it not as a flimsy tin can, but as a sturdy, purpose-built suit of armor. Furthermore, the crew's vital organs were offered additional protection by the ship's layout and stored equipment, which was strategically placed to act as supplementary radiation shielding. Mission planning also played a crucial role. The Apollo missions were scheduled during a period of relatively low solar activity to minimize the risk of additional radiation from solar flares, demonstrating how every conceivable factor was managed. The final and perhaps most convincing piece of evidence is the dosimeters the astronauts carried. These devices meticulously recorded the total radiation dose each crew member received throughout the entire mission. The data showed that the quick transit through the Van Allen belts contributed only a small fraction to their overall exposure. The total dose for an Apollo astronaut was typically around 1 to 2 rads, which is less than what a nuclear plant worker or an international airline pilot receives in a year, and far below the level considered dangerous for a short-term mission. So, rather than being an impenetrable barrier that proved the moon landings were a hoax, the successful navigation of the Van Allen belts stands as a stunning testament to the meticulous planning and engineering prowess of the thousands of people who made Apollo possible. They understood the danger not as an insurmountable wall, but as a complex problem to be solved with calculation and ingenuity, turning a potential showstopper into a managed risk. Of all the theories surrounding the moon landings, few have captured the public's imagination quite like the idea that a cinematic genius was secretly behind the camera. The story goes that NASA, realizing their technical limitations, turned to the one man who had already created the most realistic vision of spaceflight ever put to film, Stanley Kubrick. Fresh off the groundbreaking release of 2001, A Space Odyssey in 1968, Kubrick was a master of visual effects and obsessive detail. Conspiracy theorists weave a compelling narrative, suggesting that the U.S. government contracted him to direct the ultimate production, using the same techniques from his film to simulate the lunar surface on a soundstage. The supposed evidence hinges on perceived parallels: the sleek, realistic spacecraft interiors in 2001, the flawless camera work, and Kubrick's known perfectionism, which would ensure not a single mistake would slip through. It's a seductive idea that one of our greatest artistic visionaries was the architect of our greatest scientific deception. To understand why this theory gained traction, you have to appreciate the cultural impact of Kubrick's film. 2001 was a quantum leap forward in cinematic realism. Audiences had never seen spaceships move with such silent, weightless grace, and the depiction of life aboard a space station felt eerily authentic. When the Apollo broadcasts happened just a year later, the comparison was inevitable. Both featured astronauts in white suits, spoke in calm, technical jargon, and presented a vision of space exploration that felt futuristic and clean. For those inclined to doubt, it was a short leap to assume the same creative mind was behind both projects. The theory is often bolstered by out-of-context quotes and fabricated anecdotes, like the absurd claim that Kubrick confessed on his deathbed, a story repeatedly debunked by his family and colleagues. The factual timeline and the realities of filmmaking, however, completely dismantle this fantasy. First, consider the sheer impossibility of the logistics. Kubrick was famously reclusive and notoriously slow, meticulous, and secretive in his work. He was still deeply involved in the post-production and promotion of 2001 throughout 1968 and into 1969, the year of the Apollo 11 landing. The idea that he could have simultaneously secretly helmed a project of even greater scale and complexity for the U.S. government without a single credible leak from his inner circle is absurd. His wife and longtime producing partner, Christiane Kubrick, has repeatedly and vehemently denied any such involvement, calling the notion ridiculous. More importantly, a direct comparison of the technical quality between 2001 and the Apollo footage reveals why one is clearly real and the other is brilliant fiction. Kubrick's film, while stunning, was shot on 35mm film in a controlled studio environment. It used revolutionary front projection techniques for the lunar surface scenes, which, while advanced for their time, would never hold up to the scrutiny the Apollo footage has endured. The Apollo video, by contrast, was shot on a specially designed, low-resolution television camera and broadcast live. The limitations are obvious, the image is grainy, the contrast is extreme, and the camera work is shaky and often awkward because the astronauts were operating it with clumsy gloves. Kubrick, a perfectionist who demanded dozens of takes and absolute control over every frame, would never have allowed such amateurish shots to represent his work. The Apollo footage is compelling precisely because of its imperfections. It has the raw, unvarnished quality of real human beings struggling in an alien environment, a stark contrast to the composed, cinematic beauty of a Kubrick film. The very evidence used to link him to the hoax actually serves as the most powerful proof of its authenticity. The moon landings didn't need a Hollywood director, they had something far more powerful: reality. This idea that the very knowledge to travel to the moon simply vanished into thin air is one of the more persistent and strangely compelling threads in the conspiracy tapestry. Proponents argue that if we truly went to the moon 6 times between 1969 and 1972, then the technical schematics, the manufacturing processes, and the engineering know-how for the Saturn V rocket and the lunar module should be readily available. The fact that we can't simply pull these blueprints off a shelf today and build a new Saturn V is presented as definitive proof that the technology never existed in the first place. It suggests a massive cover-up where the entire program was a phantom operation, leaving behind no real hardware plans because there was no real hardware to design. This theory cleverly preys on the public's confusion between losing the physical manufacturing capability and losing the fundamental knowledge itself. The reality of what happened to the Apollo-era technology is far less sinister but speaks volumes about the nature of massive, one-off government projects and the passage of time. It is true that you cannot today call up a factory and order a new Saturn V engine. The colossal F-1 engines, for instance, were manufactured by Rocketdyne using specialized tools, custom-made alloys, and a workforce of technicians who possessed deeply specialized, hands-on skills. When the Apollo program was abruptly cancelled, the production lines were shut down. The incredibly expensive purpose-built machinery was dismantled, scrapped, or repurposed. The contracts with the thousands of subcontractors were terminated. Those skilled welders, machinists, and engineers retired or moved on to other projects. This isn't a case of files being secretly erased. It's the natural entropy of a specialized industrial base that was no longer being funded or utilized. We didn't lose the knowledge in a conspiracy. We deliberately stopped applying it and allowed the specialized industrial infrastructure to fade away. However, to say the knowledge itself was lost is a profound mischaracterization. the vast majority of the documentary record from Apollo is meticulously preserved. Hundreds of thousands of pages of technical reports, schematics, flight data, and engineering studies reside in the National Archives, in NASA-owned archives, and within university collections. A student or an engineer can access detailed drawings of the command module's heat shield, the flight plans for each mission, and the transcripts of every word spoken between the crews and mission control. What is often missing are not the top-level assembly plans, but the deepest-level vendor-specific manufacturing specifications, the exact recipe for a particular alloy, the proprietary tooling designs from a specific subcontractor that went out of business in 1980, or the undocumented craftsmanship of a master welder. This isn't unique to Apollo. It's a challenge faced by any industry trying to recreate a complex product from 50 years ago. Could we build a perfect replica of a 1969 Mustang using only original parts and methods? Probably not, because the specific supply chains and tooling are gone. But we absolutely understand the principles of the internal combustion engine and could build a car that serves the same purpose with modern technology. The knowledge from Apollo wasn't lost. It was absorbed, evolved, and became the foundation for everything that came after. The engineers and scientists who worked on Apollo didn't just vanish. They took their expertise and applied it to the space shuttle program, to commercial satellites, and to the burgeoning aerospace industry. The lessons learned, both the brilliant successes and the tragic failures, were directly encoded into the design philosophy of every spacecraft that followed. The computational systems of the Apollo guidance computer, primitive by today's standards, paved the way for the fly-by-wire systems in modern aircraft and spacecraft. The materials science developed for the heat shield informed the designs used on the shuttle and now on the Orion capsule for the Artemis program. We are not trying to resurrect the exact 50-year-old technology. We are building upon its legacy with advanced materials, vastly more powerful computers, and new manufacturing techniques like three-dimensional printing. The idea that the blueprints are missing is a red herring. The true blueprint for spaceflight is the accumulated and ever-growing knowledge of aerospace engineering, and that blueprint was written in large part by the men and women of the Apollo program. Among the darker chapters of the moon landing conspiracy lore is the grim suggestion that key individuals involved in the program were silenced to protect its secret. This theory posits that astronauts, engineers, and other personnel who might have been on the verge of exposing the hoax died under suspicious circumstances, their deaths staged as accidents or suicides. It's a narrative that taps into our deepest fears of government cover-ups and clandestine operations, transforming tragic personal losses into pieces of a sinister puzzle. The individuals most frequently cited in this grim catalogue include astronauts like Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, the crew of the Apollo 1 fire, as well as other figures like Thomas Barron, a quality control inspector, and even the rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. The story of Apollo 1 is a profound American tragedy, one that conspiracy theorists have distorted beyond recognition. On January 27, 1967, during a launch pad test, a horrific fire erupted inside the pure oxygen atmosphere of the Apollo 1 command module, claiming the lives of veterans Gus Grissom and Ed White and rookie Roger Chaffee. Theorists point to Grissom's history of outspoken criticism about the spacecraft's safety, even noting he had once hung a lemon on the simulator as evidence he was a threat who needed to be eliminated. They suggest the fire was no accident but a deliberately set murder to prevent him from blowing the whistle. The factual investigation into the fire, one of the most thorough in NASA history, reveals a far more devastating truth: catastrophic managerial and engineering failure, not malice. The cabin atmosphere was pressurized with pure oxygen at a pressure slightly higher than atmospheric, creating a tinderbox environment. An electrical arc, likely from a damaged wire near Grissom's seat, ignited the flammable nylon netting and Velcro that littered the cabin. materials chosen for convenience without adequate consideration of the fire risk. The hatch, incredibly, was a complex inward opening design that could not be quickly opened against the internal pressure that built up during the fire, trapping the crew inside. The disaster was a terrible lesson that forced a complete redesign of the spacecraft with a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, less flammable materials, and a quick opening hatch. It was a failure that nearly ended the Apollo program, making it the last thing an organization running a hoax would ever want to orchestrate. Another name often brought up is Thomas Barron, a quality control inspector for North American Aviation, the prime contractor for the Apollo command and service modules. Barron had written a highly critical 500-page report detailing numerous safety violations and procedural problems he witnessed at the Cape. He later testified before Congress about these issues. Shortly after his testimony in April 1967, Barron, his wife, and his stepdaughter were tragically killed when their car was struck by a train at a crossing. Conspiracy theorists labeled this a suspicious assassination, a hit job to silence a whistleblower. The official report from the time, however, paints a heartbreakingly mundane picture. The crossing where the accident occurred was known to be dangerous, lacking automatic gates. Witnesses stated that Barron's car simply stopped on the tracks directly in the path of the oncoming train. The subsequent investigation found no evidence of foul play or mechanical failure on the car. It was ruled a terrible accident. While Barron's criticisms were valid and part of the public record that contributed to the congressional investigation into NASA management, his death was a personal tragedy, not a conspiracy. Even the death of Wernher von Braun, the visionary German rocket engineer who became a central figure in the American space program, is sometimes woven into this narrative. Von Braun died of pancreatic cancer in 1977. Conspiracy theorists with no evidence have occasionally suggested his illness was induced to silence him later in life. This ignores the simple, cruel reality of a disease that remains notoriously difficult to treat even today. The pattern of these claims reveals a disturbing tendency to exploit genuine tragedy, replacing the complex, often painful truths of human error and misfortune with a simpler, more sensational story of murder and intrigue, a narrative that dishonors the memories of those who gave their lives in the pursuit of exploration. Now, another fascinating technical challenge that fueled the conspiracy fire wasn't about what was in the broadcast, but the sheer fact that it happened at all. Skeptics point to the live television feed from the moon and argue that the quality was simply impossible for 1969 technology. The idea of beaming a live video signal from 250,000 miles away through the vacuum of space and into living rooms around the world feels, even today, like a monumental feat. For theorists, it's a leap too far. They contend that the crisp, clear black and white images we all saw could only have been produced by a high-quality film camera on a soundstage, with the signal then being faked as a live broadcast from mission control. It's a theory built on underestimating the brilliant, obsessive engineers at NASA who saw this challenge not as a barrier, but as a puzzle they were determined to solve. The reality of how that iconic broadcast made it to our screens is a saga of innovation that's just as impressive as the rocket science that got there. It began with the camera itself, a remarkable piece of hardware developed by Westinghouse. This wasn't a standard television camera. It was specifically designed for the extreme conditions of the lunar surface. It had to be lightweight, consume very little power, and most importantly, operate in the brutal temperature swings and unforgiving light of the moon. The engineers achieved this by creating a camera that used a special, non-standard scanning rate. This is where the technical magic and the core of the misunderstanding comes into play. The camera the astronauts planted on the lunar surface didn't output a normal television signal. American televisions at the time used a format called NTSC, which scanned 525 lines of resolution at 30 frames per second. The Lunar camera, however, was a slow-scan television camera, or SSTV. It scanned much more slowly at 10 frames per second and with a higher resolution of 320 lines per frame. This was a practical choice. It required less bandwidth and power to transmit the vast distance back to Earth, but this created a massive problem. If NASA had simply beamed that slow scan signal directly to your television set, it would have been completely unintelligible, just a jumbled mess of lines and static. Your 1969 Zenith console couldn't process it. The solution was a masterpiece of analog signal conversion, a process that feels almost like alchemy. The faint SSTV signal from the moon was received by one of 3 massive 210-foot diameter radio dishes in the Deep Space Network, located in California, Australia, and Spain. This incredibly weak signal was then sent to Mission Control in Houston. There, technicians fed it into a specialized machine, a scan converter. This device literally took each individual frame of the slow scan video and displayed it on a high-quality 10-inch cathode ray tube, a special kind of monitor. A very standard broadcast-quality NTSC television camera was then pointed at this glowing 10-inch screen and filmed it, converting the moon's unique signal into a perfectly standard signal that every home television in America could understand. This multi-step process from the moon to a giant antenna to a special screen to a second camera is why some purists half-jokingly refer to the broadcast as a video of the moon. It also explains the unique visual quality. The image had a distinctive high contrast, somewhat ghosted look with a notable black border around the edge. This wasn't a flaw, it was the literal edge of that 10-inch monitor in the conversion lab, a permanent artifact of the ingenious process that made the broadcast possible. Any slight flicker or blur wasn't evidence of a film projector on a set. It was the natural result of this complex live conversion. The broadcast quality wasn't impossibly perfect. It was a brilliant, functional compromise, a testament to human ingenuity that turned an incompatible signal from another world into a shared moment for all of humanity. But what about the view from above? A more modern variation of the hoax theory looks not at the photos from the surface, but at the images taken from lunar orbit both then and now. The argument is a compelling one of scale and expectation. If we left so much equipment on the moon, 6 lunar modules, 6 moon buggies, and countless scientific packages, shouldn't we be able to see it all from a bird's-eye view? Conspiracy theorists point to early orbital photographs that show nothing but a barren, cratered landscape and declare this as final, definitive proof. The complete absence of any man-made debris in these pictures, they argue, is because there was nothing there to photograph. It's the ultimate "where's the evidence" claim, suggesting that even with our advanced technology, we can't find the artifacts because they never existed. This theory hinges on a critical misunderstanding of distance, scale, and the fundamental limits of optical resolution. To understand why we couldn't see these objects in older images, imagine trying to spot a single coffee table on a vast, empty desert from an airplane cruising at 30,000 feet. Now magnify that challenge immensely. The lunar modules, while massive up close to an astronaut, are tiny on the grand scale of the moon. The descent stage left behind on the surface is roughly the size of a small car, about 4.3 meters wide. The moon, by comparison, is over 3,400 kilometers in diameter. The early orbital photography came from the Apollo command modules themselves, which were circling at an altitude of about 100 kilometers. From that distance, trying to spot a 4-meter object is like someone in Paris trying to see a single grain of rice placed on a sidewalk in London. The camera systems on those missions, while advanced for their time, simply did not have the resolution to pick out such minute details against the vast lunarscape. Their purpose was to map broad geological features, not to play a cosmic game of "Where's Waldo" with leftover hardware. The game changer and the irrefutable evidence that silences this theory is the advent of modern lunar orbiters. Starting with missions like NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or LRO, which launched in 2009, we now have spacecraft equipped with powerful cameras specifically designed to photograph the Apollo landing sites. The LRO camera, or LROC, can resolve features on the surface as small as half a meter across from its orbit of 50 kilometers, and it has done so spectacularly. The images it has returned are breathtaking in their clarity and finality. They show the distinct shadow-casting outlines of the lunar module descent stages sitting exactly where the mission logs said they were left. You can clearly see the tracks left by the astronauts' boots, tracing their paths between the lander and the various experiments they deployed. For the later missions, the images reveal the incredibly detailed tracks of the lunar roving vehicle, weaving around craters and heading off toward distant geological targets. These are not blurry, questionable smudges. They are crisp, unambiguous records of human activity. These modern photographs do more than just debunk a conspiracy. They provide a powerful sense of closure and historical validation. They are like satellite images of ancient Roman roads or the foundations of lost cities, proving that an event described in historical records truly occurred. They connect the detailed narratives of the astronauts with physical, observable evidence from hundreds of kilometers away. The artifacts are there, precisely where we left them, silently waiting in the pristine vacuum for future explorers to visit them once more. The inability to see them with older technology wasn't a cover-up. It was merely a limitation we have now gloriously overcome, turning what was once a point of doubt into one of the most powerful confirmations of all. Another compelling argument from skeptics targets the very survivability of the lunar environment itself, focusing on its radical temperature swings. The moon, lacking any atmosphere to distribute heat, is a place of violent extremes. In direct sunlight, temperatures can soar to a blistering 260 degrees Fahrenheit, well above the boiling point of water. In shadow, they can plummet to 280 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, colder than any natural temperature ever recorded on Earth. To a casual observer, these numbers seem like an insurmountable barrier. How could a human being, encased in what looks like a sophisticated snowsuit, possibly survive being simultaneously broiled and flash-frozen? The theory suggests that the astronauts would have been cooked alive on the sunlit side and turned into human popsicles in the shade, proving their presence there was nothing but a cinematic fantasy filmed in the comfort of a climate-controlled studio. This line of thinking is powerful because it's rooted in a genuine and terrifying physical reality. The lunar surface is arguably one of the most thermally hostile environments a human has ever voluntarily entered. The conspiracy theory, however, makes the critical error of judging the spacesuit by its appearance, vastly underestimating it as a mere outfit when it was, in fact, a miniature, wearable spacecraft, a marvel of life support engineering with thermal regulation as its primary mission. The solution wasn't to create a suit that could somehow resist these immense temperatures directly, but to create a system that completely isolated the astronaut from the external environment altogether. The first and most important line of defense was reflection. The suit's outer layer was made of a white, Teflon-coated fabric designed to have a very high albedo, meaning it reflected the vast majority of the sun's incoming solar radiation. Just as wearing a white shirt keeps you cooler on a sunny day than a black one, this reflective layer prevented the sun's energy from being absorbed and heating the interior. Conversely, this same layer also helped trap the astronaut's body heat inside when in the frigid shadows, acting as a barrier against radiant heat loss. But reflection was only part of the story. The true genius lay in the internal layers of the suit. Between the tough outer shell and the inner comfort liners was a sophisticated system of insulation, primarily multiple layers of mylar and captain arranged in thin, crinkled sheets. This created a series of dead air spaces, and since air is a poor conductor of heat, this multilayer insulation acted like a super-efficient thermos bottle, dramatically slowing the transfer of heat in either direction. Whether the outside was sizzling hot or cryogenically cold, the temperature inside the suit changed very, very slowly, giving the life support system time to manage the internal climate. And that life support system was the final active component. On their backs, the astronauts wore the Portable Life Support System, or PLSS, the large backpack that was the heart and lungs of the operation. For thermal control, it contained a network of thin plastic tubes that were part of the liquid cooling and ventilation garment worn under the suit. Water was circulated through these tubes, absorbing the astronauts' metabolic body heat. This warmed water was then pumped through a sublimator, a brilliant device that released the heat into the vacuum of space by slowly boiling away a small amount of the water supply. By precisely regulating the flow of water through this network, the system could keep the astronaut at a comfortable temperature regardless of the inferno or deep freeze happening just millimeters away. They weren't battling the moon's temperature, they were existing in a self-contained, personally tailored bubble of Earth-like atmosphere, protected by a masterpiece of insulation and active cooling that turned an impossible environment into just another problem that human ingenuity had solved. Of all the artifacts brought back from the moon, the rocks were meant to be the ultimate, undeniable proof. Hundreds of kilograms of pristine lunar material collected by trained astronauts and distributed to scientists around the globe for study. Yet, for conspiracy theorists, these very samples became the center of an audacious claim that the rocks weren't lunar at all, but were either clever fakes manufactured here on Earth or rare terrestrial rocks like meteorites or volcanic formations passed off as something more exotic. This argument suggests that NASA, unable to acquire the real thing, engaged in the ultimate scientific forgery, fabricating the core evidence of their entire endeavor. The theory gained a peculiar kind of traction because it moved the debate out of the realm of grainy photographs and into the hallowed halls of science, attempting to use the language of geology itself to undermine the mission's credibility. The notion that these rocks could be faked seems plausible on the surface only if you underestimate the sheer alien complexity of the moon's geology. Lunar material is not just rock, it's a time capsule that tells a story completely different from anything formed on Earth. The most telling signature is found in the moon's soil, the fine powder called regolith. On Earth, soil is created through biological and chemical weathering, wind, water, and life breaking down rock over time. The lunar regolith, however, is the product of a relentless, airless bombardment. It's a mechanical soil created by micrometeorites pulverizing the surface over billions of years. This process creates tiny, glass-lined craters in individual grains and produces a unique mineral called amilcolite, first discovered in the Apollo 11 samples and named for A.R.M. Strong, A. Aldrin, and C.O. Lins. This mineral simply doesn't form in Earth's geological environment. Perhaps the most definitive evidence locked within the rocks is their complete lack of water. Not just on the surface, but bound within their very crystal structure. Minerals that are common on Earth, like clay or rust, which require water to form, are completely absent. Furthermore, the rocks show no signs of having been exposed to liquid water at any point in their multi-billion-year history. This is a stark contrast to even the driest, most ancient rocks on Earth, which still bear the geochemical fingerprints of our planet's watery past. The isotopic composition of the oxygen in the lunar samples is also subtly but distinctly different from that of Earth, a fingerprint pointing to a separate formation history. The clincher, however, is what the rocks reveal about the moon's violent childhood. Many of the samples are breccias, a type of rock composed of sharp, angular fragments of other rocks cemented together by the intense heat and pressure of meteorite impact. They are literal snapshots of catastrophic events frozen in time, crucially, the minerals within these rocks show evidence of having been shocked by these immense impacts, a signature that can be replicated on Earth only by specialized laboratories using high explosive charges or powerful guns. The presence of these shock features is pervasive and undeniable. Beyond NASA's own analysis, the most powerful refutation of the fake moon rock theory comes from the global scientific community. NASA distributed samples, blind and unlabeled, to hundreds of research institutions and geologists across the world, including in countries that were Cold War rivals of the United States. Scientists in the Soviet Union, who had their own lunar sample return missions with Lunar 16, 20, and 24, were among the foremost experts in the field. They had every political motive to expose an American hoax and a unique scientific ability to recognize one. Their analysis confirmed the samples were genuine, matched the composition of their own lunar samples, and were unquestionably extraterrestrial. This independent, international verification from arguably the most skeptical audience possible is perhaps the single strongest argument for their authenticity. The moon rocks weren't just confirmed by one space agency, they were validated by the entire world, making the conspiracy theory not just a claim against America, but an accusation of a global scientific conspiracy on an unimaginable scale, a notion far less credible than the moon landings themselves. Another fascinating detail that conspiracy theorists latched onto involves the tiny crosshairs or fiducial marks etched onto the camera's glass plate in every Apollo photograph. These small plus signs were a crucial tool for scientists, providing a fixed grid to accurately measure distances and scales within each image. Skeptics meticulously scoured the archives and pointed out specific instances where these crosshairs seemed to vanish, particularly when they appeared to be behind a bright object like the brilliantly white flag or the sunlit, reflective surface of the lunar module. To the untrained eye, this looked like a catastrophic editing error, as if someone had clumsily superimposed an image of the flag over a background photo and accidentally pasted it on top of the crosshairs, obscuring them. In an era before digital editing software, this was presented as a glaring, old-fashioned mistake, a telltale sign of a composite photograph fabricated in a studio. The reality behind this apparent anomaly is a perfect lesson in the physics of light and the limitations of film photography, rather than any evidence of deception. The crosshairs were physically etched onto a glass plate that sat directly in front of the film inside the camera. Under normal circumstances, they would appear superimposed over the final image. However, when the camera was aimed at an extremely bright, sunlit object, the intense light would overwhelm the photographic film's emulsion in that specific area. This phenomenon is known as overexposure or blooming. The sheer volume of light reflecting off a pristine white nylon flag or the gold foil insulation on the lunar module would completely saturate the film, washing out all fine details in that spot. The thin, dark lines of the crosshair didn't magically disappear behind the object. They were simply obliterated by the flood of light, making the bright object appear to be in front of them. It's similar to trying to see a black thread against the blazing surface of a light bulb. The bulb's intense glare makes the thread impossible to discern. This effect is a well-understood characteristic of all film photography and is even seen in digital sensors today. Furthermore, the process of duplicating and enhancing these historic images for public release sometimes involved adjustments in contrast and brightness to make the details clearer for viewing. These processing steps could further accentuate the overexposure effect, making the crosshairs in the brightest areas even less visible. Rather than being proof of a hoax, the occasional missing crosshair is actually a silent, technical validation of the photograph's authenticity, a predictable artifact caused by capturing intensely lit objects on film in the harsh, unfiltered sunlight of the lunar surface. Yet another argument against the moon landings attempts to use the language of mathematics and physics itself, proposing that the entire mission was a logistical impossibility from the very start. The theory asserts that the amount of fuel required to break free of Earth's gravity, travel 250,000 miles to the moon, land, take off again, and return home would have been astronomically beyond the capabilities of the Saturn V rocket. The sheer mass of all that propellant, the argument goes, would have required a rocket many times larger than the already colossal 110-meter-tall Saturn V. This line of thinking suggests that the mission's fuel needs created an insurmountable hurdle, a paradox that could only be resolved by concluding the journey never actually happened. It's a theory that sounds authoritative because it's couched in the seemingly irrefutable logic of rocket science. This claim fundamentally misinterprets how space travel actually works, imagining it as a continuous, powered flight like a car driving across the country, burning fuel the entire way. In reality, the brilliance of orbital mechanics is that it leverages the natural forces of the solar system to do most of the work, with rocket engines used for brief, critical bursts to change trajectory. The journey to the moon isn't a constant burn. It's a series of precisely calculated maneuvers where the spacecraft coasts for the vast majority of the trip. The Saturn V's immense power was needed for just a few minutes to achieve Earth orbit and then again for a trans-lunar injection burn, which lasted only a few more minutes. After that, the engines shut down. The command and service module, along with the lunar module, then spent 3 days silently coasting to the moon, guided by gravity alone, using barely any fuel at all. The key to the entire mission's feasibility was a brilliant fuel-saving strategy called lunar orbit rendezvous. Earlier concepts like direct ascent, which would have required a single gigantic spacecraft to land on the moon and return, were indeed fuel prohibitive. The rendezvous method was the game changer. The Saturn V didn't have to carry enough fuel to land its entire mass on the moon and launch it back. Instead, it sent a combined spacecraft into lunar orbit. From there, a small, lightweight lander, the lunar module, detached and descended to the surface using its own dedicated fuel supply. The command and service module, with its engine and fuel for the return trip, remained in orbit. When the lunar module ascended, it only had to reach lunar orbit to rendezvous, not escape the moon's gravity entirely to return to Earth. This crucial distinction saved an enormous amount of weight and fuel. Let's look at the actual numbers. The Saturn V's first stage, the S1C, burned 2,200 metric tons of kerosene and liquid oxygen in just 2.5 minutes to get the rocket off the pad and most of the way to orbit. The third stage, the S4B, then fired to achieve Earth orbit and later reignited for a 6-minute burn to send the spacecraft toward the moon. The entire outbound journey, aside from minor course corrections, was accomplished with less than 10 minutes of total engine burn time. The lunar module's descent engine used its own separate supply of hypergolic fuel, a mix of hydrazine and dinitrogen tetroxide that ignites on contact, eliminating the need for unreliable ignition systems. It burned this fuel for the 12-minute powered descent to the surface. For takeoff, the ascent stage had a smaller engine and a much smaller fuel tank, as it only needed to lift the top half of the lander back into lunar orbit. The math was not only possible, it was meticulously calculated, tested, and executed with margins to spare. The fuel calculations weren't a barrier that proved the mission fake. They were the very blueprint that made it achievable, a testament to the intellectual triumph of orbital mechanics over brute force. One of the more meticulous and visually driven hoax theories involves a side-by-side comparison of the Apollo photo archives from different missions. Conspiracy theorists, acting as cosmic detectives, claim to have found a shocking case of duplication. They point to 2 photographs, perhaps one from Apollo 15 and another from Apollo 17, that appear to show the same sweeping, nondescript plane with an eerily similar cluster of hills or boulders on the horizon. The accusation is both bold and seemingly damning. that a cash-strapped and overworked NASA, pressured to produce 6 successful landings, got lazy. They allegedly reused the same painted desert backdrop or the same soundstage set for multiple missions, never anticipating that members of the public would one day cross-reference the images and catch them in an act of cinematic recycling. This theory is presented as the ultimate evidence of cost-cutting fraud, a mistake so blatant it seems to unravel the entire multi-mission narrative. What makes this claim so compelling at first glance is the inherent strangeness of the lunar landscape itself. Without the familiar markers we use to judge terrain on Earth, no trees, no rivers, no weathering patterns from wind and water, one barren, cratered hill can look remarkably similar to another from a certain angle. Our brains are hardwired as pattern recognition machines, and they are exceptionally good at finding familiar shapes in what appears to be random chaos. When a skeptic lines up 2 photos from different missions that both show a flat plain with distant mountains, the immediate, visceral reaction can be to declare a match. It feels exactly like discovering 2 different family portraits taken in front of the same generic sunset backdrop at a department store photographer's studio. The apparent similarity feels too coincidental to be real. However, the reality of the situation, when examined with even a modest amount of geological context, completely dismantles this claim and in doing so, highlights the breathtaking diversity of the Moon's surface. Each Apollo landing site was chosen not at random, but with immense scientific deliberation, specifically for its unique and distinct geological features. The 6 successful landing sites were scattered across the near side of the Moon, ranging from the dark, relatively flat volcanic plains known as Maria to the rugged, ancient highlands. When trained geologists and planetary scientists examine these same photographs, they don't see duplicates, they see unique fingerprints, each with a story to tell. Take, for example, the backdrop of Apollo 15, which landed near Hadley Rill. This site is dominated by the towering Apennine mountain range, one of the highest on the Moon, and the site itself is characterized by the immense snaking channel of Hadley Rill, an ancient lava channel or collapsed lava tube that is kilometers long and hundreds of meters deep. The geology here is defined by these massive, linear features and the specific types of volcanic basalt found on the plain. Now compare this to the setting of Apollo 17, which landed in the Taurus Littrow Valley. This region is nestled between even more massive mountains and is famous for its distinctive, light-colored landslide deposits that tumbled down the valley slopes, its dark mantle material believed to be volcanic in origin, and its unique, brilliant orange soil discovered by astronaut Harrison Schmitt, a trained geologist. The specific angles of the slopes, the sizes and frequencies of the craters, the types of rock formations visible in the photos, all of these elements are meticulously documented and are completely unique to each specific site. The supposed matches that conspiracy theorists find are almost always a classic case of misinterpreting perspective and scale on an airless world. A hill that looks similar in 2 low-resolution photos might be half the size and dozens of kilometers further away in one image compared to the other. The Moon's lack of atmosphere creates a unique visual phenomenon where there is no aerial perspective. Distant objects don't become hazy or blue with distance as they do on Earth. This means a mountain 100 kilometers away can appear just as sharp and clear as a rock 100 meters away, which can profoundly distort our intuitive sense of distance and scale. What appears to be an identical background is actually a testament to the power of this alien perspective. Far from being proof of a hoax, the ability for scientists to clearly distinguish these 6 landing sites based on their geology is one of the strongest confirmations of their authenticity. It provides silent, stone-carved proof that humanity didn't just go to the Moon once. We explored 6 different worlds, each with its own dramatic and unique history written across its surface. This brings us to one of the more technically complex conspiracy theories, one that suggests NASA was caught completely off guard by a danger they should have known about. The claim posits that the agency had no real understanding of the Van Allen radiation belt surrounding Earth and therefore could not have possibly planned a safe trajectory through them. The theory often implies that the astronauts encountered these deadly zones unexpectedly, and their survival was nothing short of a miracle, or more likely, proof that they never actually made the trip. It's an argument that paints a picture of a reckless agency flying blind, relying on luck rather than science, a narrative that fundamentally misrepresents one of the most thoroughly calculated aspects of the entire Apollo program. The reality is that the existence and general structure of the Van Allen belts were not a mysterious, last-minute discovery. Their presence was confirmed in 1958 by the Explorer 1 satellite, the first successful U.S. satellite, which carried a cosmic ray detector designed by Dr. James Van Allen himself. Throughout the 1960s, a series of follow-up missions, including the Pioneers 3 and 4 and the Explorers 4 and 14, meticulously mapped the belt's intensity, their contours, and how they fluctuated with solar activity. By the time President Kennedy set the goal for a lunar landing, NASA scientists had over a decade of data. They knew the belts consisted of two primary zones, an inner belt of highly energetic protons and an outer belt of electrons, with a somewhat less hazardous gap between them, often called the slot. This was not a secret, it was published public scientific knowledge. Mission planning didn't just acknowledge the belts, it was fundamentally shaped by them. Engineers and physicists treated the radiation not as an impenetrable wall, but as a navigational hazard to be charted and avoided as much as possible, like a sailor plotting a course around a treacherous reef. The solution was a masterclass in applied physics. The first decision was trajectory. The Saturn V rocket did not fly straight up and out. Instead, it launched into a parking orbit around Earth. This allowed mission controllers to precisely calculate the trans-lunar injection burn, the engine firing that would send the spacecraft toward the Moon. This path was carefully designed to bypass the most intense regions of the inner proton belt by going through the thinner, northernmost section of the belts, minimizing both the intensity and the duration of exposure. The second layer of the strategy was speed. The Apollo spacecraft traveled at tremendous velocity, approximately 25,000 miles per hour. This meant their passage through the most hazardous regions of the belts was measured in hours, not days. The total transit time through both belts was typically between 60 and 90 minutes. While the radiation levels were high, the brief exposure time kept the accumulated dose within manageable limits. Finally, the spacecraft itself was a shield. The hull of the command module was constructed from an aluminum alloy, which provided effective protection against the specific types of radiation in the belts. The ship's structure, along with strategically stowed equipment and supplies, offered additional shielding for the crew's most radiation-sensitive organs. This passive protection was a critical component of the overall design philosophy. Furthermore, every astronaut carried a personal dosimeter, and the ship had radiation sensors that continuously monitored the environment, providing real-time data that confirmed the exposure levels were well within the pre-mission safety thresholds. The plan wasn't to avoid the belts entirely. That was impossible, but to minimize exposure through a combination of smart routing, high speed, and robust vehicle design. The successful transit through the Van Allen belts stands not as a lucky accident, but as a brilliant validation of years of preparatory science and meticulous engineering. Yet another argument ventured beyond the technical and into the deeply personal, scrutinizing the behavior of the astronauts themselves in the aftermath of their incredible journeys. Conspiracy theorists pointed to post-mission press conferences and interviews, suggesting the men who walked on the Moon seemed oddly detached, evasive, or even nervous when answering questions. Their body language was dissected, averted gazes, hesitant answers, and a perceived lack of the unbridled joy one might expect from someone who had just accomplished the pinnacle of human exploration were all presented as evidence. The theory posits that these were not heroes struggling to articulate a profound experience, but rather actors struggling to remember their lines, burdened by the guilt of perpetuating a massive lie on a global stage. This line of attack is particularly potent because it targets the human element, attempting to undermine the credibility of the individuals at the very heart of the story. A key piece of footage often cited is the Apollo 11 post-flight press conference, where Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins faced the world's media. To a modern audience accustomed to soundbites and charismatic celebrity, their demeanor can indeed seem subdued. They speak in calm, measured tones, using highly technical language. They often pause thoughtfully before answering, and their expressions are serious. For a conspiracy theorist, this reads as stilted and scripted, the behavior of men who are being extremely careful not to slip up. However, this interpretation completely ignores the context of who these men were and the immense professional and psychological weight they were under. First and foremost, these were not performers. They were test pilots and engineers selected for their coolness under pressure, their analytical minds, and their ability to remain unflappable in life or death situations. Their entire careers were built on precision, caution, and a methodical approach to problem solving. Their speaking style wasn't evasive, it was simply professional and technical, reflecting their core identities. They were trained to report facts, not emote for cameras. Furthermore, the idea that they would be bursting with effusive, emotional joy misjudges the moment. They had just endured an incredibly dangerous mission where a single mistake could have meant a horrific death stranded in the void of space. The emotional release for that kind of experience is often not jubilation, but a deep, contemplative exhaustion and a sober appreciation for their own survival. The pressure of the moment itself cannot be overstated. They were sitting before the entire world, representing not just themselves but thousands of their colleagues, their country, and the entirety of NASA. Every word they uttered would be analyzed and recorded for history. Is it any wonder they were deliberate and careful? They were describing events so far outside the realm of normal human experience that there was no earthly vocabulary for it. How does one describe the feeling of looking back at your entire world as a beautiful, fragile marble hanging in the blackness? Their pauses and searches for words seem less like a cover-up and more like the genuine struggle of a human mind grappling with the sublime and the ineffable. Later astronauts, like the effusive and geologically trained Harrison Schmitt of Apollo 17, did show more overt excitement, particularly when discussing scientific discoveries. This variation in personality further reinforces the authenticity of their reactions. They weren't reading from a script, they were expressing their genuine selves. The seemingly suspicious behavior wasn't a sign of guilt, but the ultimate proof of their authenticity. It was the predictable reaction of humble, hyper-competent professionals who had been to the edge of human experience and back, now tasked with explaining the unexplainable to those of us who had never left Earth. Another compelling thread in the conspiracy tapestry focuses not on what we saw, but on what we heard. The impossibly clear voice communications between the astronauts on the lunar surface and mission control back in Houston. To many skeptics, the crisp, static-free quality of these conversations, broadcast live from nearly 240,000 miles away, defied all logic. We've all experienced the faint crackle and dropouts on a long-distance terrestrial phone call, so the idea of a flawless audio link from another world felt to them like a technological leap too far for 1969. The theory suggests this clarity is the ultimate proof that the astronauts were actually much closer to home, broadcasting from a secret transmitter just a few miles away, perhaps even from the very studio where the video was being faked. It's an argument that feels intuitively right based on our everyday frustrations with signal loss. The reality of how that iconic communication was achieved is one of the most overlooked marvels of the Apollo program, a global effort of staggering engineering precision. The secret didn't lie in a single magical piece of hardware, but in a meticulously designed and worldwide network of infrastructure. It begins with the astronauts' equipment. Their backpack-like portable life support system contained a powerful transmitter and a highly sensitive microphone, the latter being a unique design called the microphone/speaker/control group. This wasn't a standard microphone. It was a pressure-sensitive device that used the vibrations of the astronaut's throat to pick up speech, a crucial feature for working in a pressurized suit where normal voice transmission would be muffled. This allowed for remarkably clear audio pickup even through the helmet, but the real magic happened on the journey back to Earth. The radio signal, like a faint whisper in a vast cathedral, began its quarter-million-mile trip as a very weak transmission. If NASA had tried to receive it with a single antenna, it would have been lost in the cosmic noise almost instantly. The solution was the manned spaceflight network, a constellation of massive radio dishes strategically placed around the globe. Key stations in Goldstone, California, Madrid, Spain, and Canberra, Australia, were positioned so that as the Earth rotated, at least one facility was always in direct line of sight with the Moon, ensuring an uninterrupted connection. These weren't simple radio antennas, they were colossal parabolic dishes, some as large as 210 feet in diameter, acting like gigantic ears straining to catch every whisper from the void. These stations didn't just listen, they amplified. The incredibly faint signal received by the dish was boosted by a cryogenically cooled parametric amplifier, a device chilled with liquid helium to reduce its own internal electronic noise to an absolute minimum. This allowed the stations to amplify the whisper of a signal without simultaneously amplifying the static that would drown it out. This cleaned-up signal was then converted and relayed via undersea cable and communications satellites to a central switching center at Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland, and from there sent directly to Mission Control in Houston. The entire process, from the astronaut speaking into his mic in the Sea of Tranquility to his voice coming out of a speaker in Houston, took less than 2.5 seconds. The clarity wasn't proof of a nearby broadcast. It was the audible result of a planet-sized amplifier, a testament to human collaboration and engineering on an unprecedented scale. That crystal-clear audio is the sound of a world working together to listen to three men on another. Moving from the scrutiny of human behavior to a piece of hardware left behind, we encounter a theory that cleverly targets a specific, seemingly mundane piece of evidence: the Lunar Laser Ranging Retroreflector. The claim suggests that this device, a small array of mirrors left on the surface by the Apollo 11, 14, and 15 crews, couldn't possibly function as described, and that the technical documentation for its design and deployment is suspiciously absent. Conspiracy theorists argue that if this crucial piece of equipment was real, its schematics would be readily available, and its signal would be easily verifiable by amateur astronomers. The apparent difficulty in detecting its return signal, coupled with the complex nature of the science, is presented as proof that the whole thing is an elaborate ruse, a prop left on a soundstage desert to provide a long-term excuse for the hoax. To understand why this argument holds any water, you first have to grasp what this device was meant to do. A retroreflector is a brilliantly simple yet powerful tool. Unlike a standard mirror which reflects light back at an angle, a retroreflector is designed to send any incoming light beam directly back to its source, no matter what angle it arrives from. Think of the reflective panels on a bicycle or the safety strips on a highway worker's vest. They shine brightly when hit by headlights because they're sending that light right back to the driver's eyes. The lunar versions are far more precise, consisting of an array of 100 corner cube prisms made of fused silica glass, each ground to an optical precision of a few arcseconds. The Apollo 11 array had 100 of these tiny prisms, while the larger Apollo 14 and 15 arrays had 300. Their sole purpose was to sit on the Moon and passively wait for a laser beam from Earth. The science behind this, called lunar laser ranging, is deceptively simple in concept but breathtakingly difficult in execution. Observatories on Earth, like the McDonald Observatory in Texas or the Grasse Station in France, fire powerful pulses of laser light at the spot on the Moon where the retroreflector was left. The pulse of light, made up of trillions of photons, travels the nearly 240,000 miles to the Moon. A tiny fraction of those photons, literally just a handful, hit the array square on and are reflected directly back along the path they came from. An even tinier fraction of those make the return trip back to Earth, where they are captured by a telescope co-located with the laser. By precisely measuring the round-trip travel time of that light pulse, which is about 2.5 seconds, scientists can calculate the distance between the observatory and the reflector with an accuracy of a few millimeters. This is where the conspiracy theory finds its foothold. The signal is incredibly weak. We're talking about detecting maybe one single photon for every 10 quadrillion cent. This requires immensely powerful lasers, incredibly sensitive detectors, and pristine atmospheric conditions. It is absolutely not something a backyard astronomer with a consumer-grade telescope can hope to achieve. This inaccessibility allows skeptics to claim the results are fabricated, that the scientific community is simply pretending to receive a signal that isn't there. They further argue that the technical plans for these devices must be missing, as no independent party could verify their design. The reality, however, is that these reflectors have been one of the most enduring and fruitful scientific experiments in human history, continuously in operation for over 5 decades. The data they have provided is anything but silent. By measuring the precise distance to the Moon over time, scientists have been able to conduct profound tests of Einstein's theory of general relativity, precisely track the Moon's slowly increasing orbital distance from Earth. It's moving away at about 3.8 centimeters per year. Study the Moon's faint gravitational wobble, which reveals information about its liquid core, and contribute to our understanding of tectonic plate movements on Earth. This is not data that can be faked. It requires a constant physical signal from a moving target. The documentation for the retroreflectors is not only available in NASA technical reports, but the principles behind them are standard optical physics taught in university classrooms. The continued, verified use of these arrays by observatories across the globe, from the United States to France to Italy, stands as a silent, persistent, and millimeter-precise rebuttal to the claim that nothing was left behind on that distant, dusty shore. Perhaps one of the most persistent and technically focused conspiracy theories argues that the entire Apollo mission was a computational impossibility. The reasoning seems sound on the surface. How could a spacecraft navigate nearly 240,000 miles to the Moon, land on its surface, and return to a precise splashdown in the ocean using a computer that had less processing power than a modern digital watch? The Apollo Guidance Computer, or a GC, had a clock speed of only 2.048 MHz and a mere 72 kilobytes of read-only memory. By today's standards, that's beyond primitive. It's almost laughable. We carry devices in our pockets millions of times more powerful. To skeptics, this vast technological gulf is the ultimate proof that the Moon landings were staged. They contend that the computing firepower required for such a feat simply didn't exist in the 1960s, making the entire narrative a work of science fiction. This argument makes a critical error, however, by judging 1960s technology by 21st century standards and misunderstanding the fundamental nature of the computer's role. The GC wasn't designed to be a general-purpose powerhouse. It was a specialized instrument, a purpose-built navigational and control system honed to perform a specific set of tasks with flawless reliability. Its genius wasn't in raw processing speed, but in its elegant, minimalist design and its revolutionary software architecture. The machine used something called core rope memory, where software was literally hardwired by hand by teams of technicians, mostly women, who threaded wires through tiny magnetic cores. This made the software incredibly robust and immune to being erased or corrupted by radiation, a vital feature for a journey through space. It was literally read-only memory. The program couldn't crash because you couldn't accidentally delete it. The computer's real job wasn't to do everything itself, but to act as the central nervous system for the mission, processing inputs from a suite of sensors and providing the astronauts with the critical information they needed to make decisions. It didn't fly the spacecraft autonomously. It enabled the human pilots to fly it with superhuman precision. For example, during the lunar descent, the AGC wasn't steering the lander. It was continuously calculating and displaying the vehicle's altitude, vertical speed, and horizontal velocity onto a simple numerical display called the DSKY, pronounced DSKY. The astronaut pilot, watching these numbers, would then use his hand controller to adjust the thrust and attitude, essentially playing a high-stakes video game where the computer provided the real-time stats. The system was designed for human-in-the-loop control, leveraging the astronauts' training and instincts for situations that required judgment, while the computer handled the complex, lightning-fast calculations. This partnership between human and machine was the true key to success. The astronauts, particularly the commanders and lunar module pilots, underwent thousands of hours of simulation, training for every conceivable contingency. They could, and on Apollo 14 famously had to, perform critical navigational calculations manually with a sextant if the computer failed. The AGC was their invaluable tool, not their master. It provided them with the digital clarity to navigate a realm where human senses were useless. To claim the computer was too weak is to miss the point entirely. It wasn't weak, it was perfectly, brilliantly adequate for the job it was designed to do. A masterpiece of engineering that achieved more with 72 kilobytes than most modern software does with 72 gigabytes. Another fascinating detail seized upon by skeptics focuses on the very footsteps left behind by the astronauts, pointing to what seems like a glaring paradox. The argument is simple and grounded in our everyday experience here on Earth. To make a crisp, well-defined footprint in sand or soil, you need moisture. Think of building a sandcastle on the beach. Dry sand simply collapses and flows like a liquid, refusing to hold a shape. Only when you add water does the sand become cohesive enough to form detailed structures and sharp footprints. The lunar surface, being a complete vacuum with no atmospheric water vapor whatsoever, should be the driest, most powdery environment imaginable. Therefore, the conspiracy theory posits the incredibly clear and sharp footprints seen in the Apollo photographs are a physical impossibility. They look exactly like footprints made in wet sand, a clear sign that the scenes were filmed in a moist, earthly environment, not on an airless, arid moon. This line of thinking is so compelling because it's based on a perfectly logical earthly observation, but it makes one critical error. It assumes that lunar soil, or regolith, behaves like any sand we're familiar with on our planet. The reality is that the regolith is a substance forged in a completely alien laboratory, and its properties are unlike anything found naturally on Earth. The Moon has no atmosphere, which means it has been bombarded by micrometeorites for billions of years without any protection. This constant, gentle rain of tiny impacts has pulverized the surface rock into an incredibly fine powder, but the process doesn't stop there. Each microscopic impact also generates intense, localized heat that fuses the surrounding dust particles together, creating tiny, jagged, and glassy agglutinates. The result is a material with a complex and contradictory nature. It's fine and powdery, yet each individual grain is sharp, angular, and covered in microscopic hooks and barbs from this constant welding process. On Earth, rounded sand grains slide past each other easily, which is why dry sand flows. On the Moon, the jagged, interlocking grains of regolith cling to each other through friction and mechanical cohesion. Stepping on this surface is less like stepping on a dry beach and more like stepping on freshly fallen, fine snow that's just cold enough for the flakes to stick together, or perhaps like walking across a pile of incredibly fine, sharp baking flour where the particles have a natural tendency to clump. The vacuum environment actually enhances this effect. With no air between the grains to act as a lubricant, the friction and cohesion between the particles are even stronger. So when an astronaut's boot pressed down, it didn't simply push grains aside. It compacted these cohesive, interlocking particles, forcing the jagged edges to snag and lock together into a stable, rigid structure. The footprint holds its shape not because of moisture, but because of the raw, unfiltered physics of a vacuum and the unique geology of a world without weather. The perfect preservation of these footprints isn't evidence of a hoax. It's a direct and beautiful consequence of the Moon's airless environment, a permanent sculpture carved not by water, but by the sheer, stark physics of an alien world. Those iconic impressions are a silent, lasting testament to a landscape where a footprint can remain untouched by wind or rain for millions of years, waiting for another visitor to come and see it. Another visually compelling argument put forward by skeptics involves the apparent lack of a dramatic dust storm during the lunar module's final descent. When we watch footage of a helicopter landing in a dusty desert here on Earth, it kicks up a massive, billowing cloud that can completely obscure the ground and the vehicle itself. A rocket engine, even a smaller one, should be far more powerful. The expectation, then, is that the landing of the lunar module should have been preceded by an enormous, opaque plume of dust, completely hiding the landing site from the astronaut's view and the camera's lens until the very last second. The fact that the video shows a relatively clear view of the surface right up to touchdown, with only a faint, dissipating haze, is presented as another cinematic error, proof that the engine wasn't really firing and the module was just being lowered on a set. This theory, while intuitive, is built on a misunderstanding of how rocket exhaust behaves when it's freed from the constraints of an atmosphere. On Earth, a rocket plume or a helicopter's rotor downwash interacts with our air. The exhaust gases mix violently with the atmospheric gases, creating a turbulent, expanding cloud. This cloud then acts as a fluid, picking up loose dust and sand particles, swirling them around and carrying them high into the air to create that characteristic obscuring plume. The presence of air is the crucial ingredient that turns a jet of gas into a widespread dust storm. The Moon, of course, has no such atmosphere. This changes everything. In the vacuum of space, the lunar module's exhaust gases expand radially outward from the nozzle in a much wider, but far less turbulent cone. Without air molecules to push against and mix with, the gas particles simply follow their own trajectories away from the engine at tremendous speed. This creates a very different kind of interaction with the lunar soil. The high-velocity gas hits the surface and immediately scatters the fine dust particles outward in a flat, sheet-like pattern, much like a shotgun blast. The particles are not buoyed up by a sustaining atmosphere. They follow purely ballistic parabolic arcs. Each individual grain of dust is launched on its own trajectory, and without air resistance to slow it down, it simply flies away on that path until it lands, often hundreds of meters from the landing site. There is no cloud because there's no air to suspend the particles and create a cloud-like effect. Furthermore, the engine's throttle setting was critical. During the final, critical approach phase, the astronauts were not descending under full power. They were flying horizontally, scanning for a safe landing spot. The engine was throttled to maintain a constant altitude, and its thrust was mostly directed horizontally across the surface, blowing dust outward to the sides rather than straight down. It was only in the final moments of the landing phase that the engine was throttled up to arrest the final rate of descent. but even then, the thrust was precisely controlled to be just enough to counter the lander's weight in the moon's weak gravity. The force applied to the surface was a firm but directed push, not a violent, continuous blast. The lack of a massive, obscuring dust cloud wasn't a special effects oversight. It was the precise and predicted outcome of a rocket engine operating exactly as designed in the most alien of environments. Of all the theories questioning the moon landings, perhaps the most sweeping in scope suggests the entire endeavor was less a triumph of science and more a masterstroke of political theater. This narrative posits that the timing of Apollo 11's success was far too convenient, perfectly staged to achieve maximum political advantage for the United States. The argument hinges on the geopolitical tension of the Cold War, pointing to the late 1960s as a period of profound domestic turmoil for America. With a nation fractured by the Vietnam War, widespread social unrest and assassinations, the theory suggests the government desperately needed a monumental propaganda victory to restore national pride and global prestige. Landing on the moon, the ultimate symbol of technological superiority, is presented as a perfectly timed diversion, a spectacle so grand it would make the world forget America's earthly struggles. The implication is that the mission was rushed, that the technology wasn't truly ready, and that the whole event was orchestrated for the cameras to meet a political deadline rather than an engineering one. To understand why this theory feels plausible, you have to step back into the fever-pitch atmosphere of the space race. The Soviet Union had been humiliating the United States for years, launching the first satellite, Sputnik, then sending the first living creature, then the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit. President John F. Kennedy's famous 1961 speech committing the nation to a moon landing before the decade was out was explicitly a response to this perceived technological lag. The space race was never just about exploration. It was a proxy war for ideological supremacy between capitalism and communism, fought with rockets instead of missiles. In this context, the idea that a government would go to extreme lengths to win is not entirely far-fetched. The late 1960s were indeed a time of intense pressure. The immense cost of the Vietnam War was straining the Apollo program's budget, and public support for such expensive stunts was waning. A dramatic success was needed to justify the billions already spent. However, this theory makes a critical error by confusing motivation with capability. While the political will and the fierce competition were undoubtedly the fuel that funded and drove the Apollo program, they could not magically bypass the immutable laws of physics and the meticulous timeline of engineering development. The notion that the landing was rushed for a political photo op ignores the grueling, methodical, and often painfully slow process of building and testing the most complex machine ever conceived. The launch date for each Apollo mission was not plucked from a political calendar. It was the final outcome of a colossal pyramid of prerequisite milestones. Before Apollo 11 could even be considered, NASA had to successfully develop and test the colossal Saturn V rocket, a process that involved multiple unmanned test flights like Apollo 4 and Apollo 6 to verify its stages and the immense stresses of launch. The Lunar module, a bizarre and spidery vehicle unlike any other, had to be tested in Earth orbit during Apollo 9 and then in lunar orbit during Apollo 10, where it flew within miles of the surface without landing. Perhaps the most compelling evidence against the rushed timing theory is the fact that NASA was not operating on a single do-or-die timeline. The agency was prepared for setbacks, and they happened. The Apollo 1 fire in 1967 was a devastating tragedy that set the program back by over a year as the command module was completely redesigned for safety. This delay alone proves that safety and technical readiness, not an arbitrary political deadline, were the paramount concerns. If the goal was purely propaganda, they would have cut corners after the fire to get back on schedule. Instead, they stopped, mourned, and fundamentally re-engineered the spacecraft, Furthermore, the success of Apollo 11 was not a singular event. It was followed by 5 more successful landing missions, each more sophisticated than the last, with Apollo 12 performing a pinpoint landing near a previous surveyor probe and Apollo 17 conducting extensive geological fieldwork. A hoax might have been attempted once, but to stage 6 increasingly complex missions over 3 years, with each success raising the stakes and the risk of exposure, defies all logic. The timing was not suspiciously convenient. It was the hard-won result of a decade of sustained national effort, unimaginable ingenuity, and a willingness to pause and learn from tragedy, ultimately culminating at the exact moment the technology was finally, truly ready. We have journeyed through a landscape of imagination as vast as the cosmos itself, from flags supposedly fluttering in a non-existent breeze to the silent, starless skies accused of being a cheap studio backdrop. We've untangled the physics behind the Van Allen radiation belts and debunked the curious case of the missing blast crater. We've even explored the bizarre notion that Stanley Kubrick himself was the auteur behind the greatest deception in human history. Each of these 33 theories, in its own absurd way, represents a fascinating attempt to make sense of something so extraordinary it feels almost unbelievable. What is perhaps most compelling about these conspiracy theories isn't their scientific merit, but what they reveal about us. They persist not because of the strength of their evidence, but because they tap into powerful human emotions, a deep-seated skepticism of authority, a natural distrust of grand institutions, and the irresistible allure of a secret narrative that promises to reveal a hidden truth. In a complex world, a simple lie can often feel more satisfying than a complicated truth. The moon landings were the result of unimaginable complexity, the work of hundreds of thousands of people, countless tiny innovations, and meticulous problem-solving. The hoax narrative, by contrast, offers a tidy, albeit sinister, alternative that's easier for some to digest. Yet the real story is so much more magnificent. The truth reveals our species at its very best, collaborative, courageous, and endlessly ingenious. It's a story of using slide rules to chart a course to another world, of stitching together a global network of antennas to hear a whisper from 250,000 miles away, and of sewing life support systems into suits that could withstand the violent extremes of an airless desert. The overwhelming evidence, from the independently verified moon rocks to the laser reflectors still pinging back signals today, doesn't just prove we went to the moon. It celebrates the breathtaking scale of human achievement. So the next time you encounter a conspiracy theory, whether it's about the moon landings or anything else, I encourage you to embrace that critical thinking spark that makes you question in the first place. But then, take the next step, follow the evidence, listen to the experts who have dedicated their lives to these fields, and appreciate the beautiful, often complex reality. The truth is out there, and it's more incredible than any fiction. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Which of these absurd theories did you find the most creatively entertaining? Was it the idea of Kubrick's secret directing gig, or the notion that astronauts were dangling on wires? Let me know your favorite piece of lunar lunacy down in the comments below.